In this video, I'm going to discuss a number of non-technical topics that I feel that you should review prior to taking the Green Belt exam. The first set of topics I've classified under the heading of team tools, and these tools really reflect how DMAIC projects often actually happen in practice in organizations, which is quite different than the way I described DMAIC in the course, which was much more an ideal state of problem solving. Now, to say that these team tools reflect how DMAIC oftentimes occurs in real organizations is not to say that this is a good thing, because in reality, many DMAIC teams simply get people together and brainstorm solutions to the problem, which they then implement and hopefully check with data actually do cause improvement. But as we discussed when we discussed Kume's thinking about problem solving, this is really trying to solve problems by taking action. And as Kume indicated, this is a relatively slow and non-informative way to improve things because you never really understand the connection between causes and effects. And that's the distinction between, in some sense, immature problem-solving teams and much more mature problem-solving teams. But anyway, here are team tools that relate to brainstorming. And you probably basically know what brainstorming is. In general, the way it works is that you get a group of people together to put forward ideas about whatever kind of problem it is that they're trying to solve. But brainstorming as a formal idea has some characteristics. And the first is that it encourages the quantity of ideas. The second is that judgment should be withheld with respect to how good those ideas are, certainly in the beginning until all the ideas have been put forth. The fourth idea in brainstorming is that unusual or offbeat ideas are welcomed. And the final idea, which is really consistent with not being judgmental, is that you should take the ideas that are put forward and combine and build on them. And one way I've heard this put is that you should erase from your mind the language of no but, and instead try building on other ideas by saying yes and the and then shows how to expand or improve that idea. So the key idea about brainstorming then is you want a lot of quantity and you want to withhold judgment. Now, there is a formalized kind of brainstorming called the Nominal Group Technique, and it's a structured approach to eliciting ideas, which is intended to ensure the participation of everybody and to thwart the dominance of the idea generation process by a few individuals. This dominance by a few individuals frequently happens for a variety of reasons. Some people just tend to be dominant in the meetings. Other people have dominance by virtue of their expertise or because of their power in the organization, their job title, and so on. But what the nominal group technique involves is the silent generation of ideas, writing them down, then the listing of those ideas without judgment. There's a phase that involves discussion and clarification of the ideas, and it generally concludes by voting on the ideas using a technique called multivoting, which allows everybody to vote on more than one idea. So here's the multivoting technique. The idea of multivoting is that each person can vote for more than one thing. There are a number of different ways you can do this. There is an approach specifically described by ASQ, the American Society for Quality, that can be found at the link below. And this link is active in the presentation, so you can click on it. But here is the basic ASQ multivoting process. The first thing is that there's an introduction, and you decide on how many items people are going to vote for. So they recommend no more than 10, but for example, you might decide that people are going to vote on the top 5 items. Then each person ranks the items so that if there are n items, the top choice gets n points. So if there are 5 items, the item that you rank number 1, the best, is going to get 5 points, and then the next one down is going to get 4 points, all the way down to the last item that you rank, which will get 1 point. Those scores are then averaged for all items across all of the participants voting, and they end up giving an overall ranking of the items. There are other approaches for multi-voting. One is to give everybody a certain number of points, like 10, and ask them to then divvy those points up between the items that they think should get points. Then you can follow a similar procedure where the total number of points on each item is averaged across individuals. Now we're going to turn our attention to another topic relating to teams, which I did mention in class several times, and it's called the group process, put forward by Tuckman in 1965 and then revised again quite a bit later in 1977. But it's supposed to describe the natural phases that groups of people, and in particular teams, go through when they form to address a particular problem or process. And those 4 stages are forming, norming, storming, and performing. And then in the later paper, Tuckman added a phase of adjourning. But the idea of forming is that there's a phase where people first meet up and they get to know each other. The next phase is storming, where basically the team is, in a sense, arguing or discussing strongly or whatever what its values are around doing the work or whatever it's going to do. Then there's a phase where a consensus is reached about what those values and strategies are going to be. That's the norming phase. And then once those values are normed on, there is the final phase of performing the work effectively. So I think these team stages are important because I think there's more than just a little bit of truth in them. I will point out that having formalized processes like DMAIC, however, should reduce the forming, storming, and norming stages of the team dramatically, because the performance strategy for how the team is going to work and the tools that are going to be used are now defined by the DMAIC process, which presumably the team members have been trained in. Now, the next topic that I wanted to mention about teams is the idea of roles in the team. In order to have effective teams, there needs to be a lot of clarity around what the roles are and what responsibilities those roles incorporate. So I've got a few roles here that I think are potentially important in teams. Obviously, the team leader is very important, and defining the role of the team leader is a fairly big topic. The team leader, for example, tends to set the agenda, tends to decide on the direction of the team, oftentimes is responsible for staffing the team, and so on. But there are at least 3 other roles that it is well worth keeping in mind if you want to have effective teams and effective team meetings. The second role I have listed here is called the recorder. The recorder is the person who is responsible for capturing the ideas and information in the team on flip charts typically. And it's important to have that role defined so that the key things that are happening in the meeting do in fact get captured. Another important role in the team is the timekeeper. And in conjunction with the team leader should, in creating the agenda for the team, indicate some idea of how much time the individual items are going to take. The role of the timekeeper then is to keep the meeting on schedule so that the various aspects of the meeting do not take substantially more time than they were budgeted for. The last role I have listed here is the facilitator. In many cases, the facilitator is not a part of the team, although they could be, but the real role of the facilitator is to keep the team following whatever the team process is supposed to be. So in the context of Six Sigma, where for many of the teams at least the process is DMAIC, the role of the facilitator is to keep the team following the DMAIC process. Sometimes the facilitator is also a bit of a consultant in that they not only keep the team following the process, but they also suggest ways in which the team might use the process. For example, the facilitator could serve as a resource for what tools the team perhaps should be using, and also how to use those tools. This next topic is one that the Greenbelt exam loves to ask questions about, and that is whether or not things are hard versus soft savings. So by savings here, we're typically thinking about the savings that are generated by the improvement projects. And I want to say before we get into this that the savings claimed by DMAIC teams and improvement teams in general seldom translate to the organization's bottom line directly. So what you end up seeing in the bottom line is typically substantially less than the claimed savings. And there are a variety of reasons that this happens. For example, one reason this happens is that the same savings are oftentimes counted by related projects. But anyway, hard versus soft savings. Hard savings are anything that can pretty much immediately be quantified and realized. These are the hard savings. Soft savings are any savings that are indirect or difficult to measure or not realized in the immediate future. These are the soft savings. Hard savings and soft savings are discussed in the textbook, and here is what the textbook has to say about hard savings. Hard savings are actual reductions in dollars now being spent, such as reduced budgets, fewer employees, reduction of prices paid on purchasing contracts, and so on. Hard savings can be used to lower prices, change bid models, increase profits, or for other purposes where a high degree of confidence in the benefit is required. So they're very tangible savings. Soft savings are less tangible, so here's what the textbook has to say. Soft savings are projected reductions that should result from the project. For example, savings from less inventory, reduced testing, lower cycle times, improved yields, lower rework rates, and reduced scrap. Now, these categories tend to be somewhat ambiguous, which is why I'm going into this in the detail that I am. But the key idea is that hard savings are immediate and tangible, and soft savings are less tangible or less immediate or both. So there is an I6 Sigma article that I will provide a link for on the next slide that lists out some common hard savings and soft savings. So the common hard savings are reduction in unit cost of operation, reduction in unit cost of production, reduction in transaction cost, reduction in overhead cost, reduction in transportation cost, reduction in manpower, increased throughput resulting in increased sales or revenue, and that would be immediately. The soft savings, according to this article, are things like reduction in cash flow, reduction in the need for working capital, avoidance of capacity enhancement, confirmation to changes in the law, increased safety in the workplace, increased employee satisfaction, increased customer satisfaction. Now, I find some of these a bit ambiguous because reduction in cash flow could very well be an immediate savings, but I'm showing you the categories that this reference has given to try to help guide you in case you have questions on the Greenbelt exam that are ambiguous. So hard and soft savings, again, are a kind of question which is fairly frequently asked on these kinds of exams. The next topic that I want to address is the idea of stakeholders, and I think you have a very clear idea of what stakeholders are. They are everyone who has an interest in the outcome of a process or of a project or whatever, or is affected by its performance. The actual customers are, in fact, stakeholders, but we need to be very clear about what a customer is. A customer is an external entity, either person or a corporation, that pays for the product or the service. Okay, they're not internal. And in particular, senior management is not a customer. They are stakeholders. And this is really why we need the two terms. There are customers that are external to the organization and that are paying the bills in a sense. And then there are other people who care about the outcomes, such as senior managers, but they are not customers. They are stakeholders. Processes can have, quote, internal customers, unquote, but this is a term that is distinct from the term customer. When you talk about a customer, you are talking about somebody external to the organization. If you're talking about somebody internal to the organization, they are either a stakeholder or an internal customer, where that word internal is very important in making the distinction between people who are real customers and people who are not. Now, having mentioned internal customers, I am going to now talk about the internal customer supplier model, and this is an important idea. Interfaces and crossing of boundaries in organizations causes all kinds of problems. So these could be interfaces between departments or interfaces between a supplier and the company, but anytime there is a process or a product or a service crossing a boundary, there's very, very likely to be problems. In fact, if you wanted to know where to go look for problems, go look at boundaries. And the internal customer supplier model is one strategy for trying to address this issue of boundaries. So an internal supplier to a process is any internal entity, any internal person or department or other internal process that supplies materials or resources or any other product or service that's an input to an internal process. An internal customer of a process then is similarly any entity that receives any product or service that is produced by an internal process. So as I've said before, the term customer by itself is distinct from the term internal customer. Customer refers to people that are outside the organization. Internal customer refers to people that are not outside the organization. And these really should be treated as distinct terms. Now the problem, of course, is that oftentimes internal customers have a totally different idea about what the standard is for a particular product or service that's being delivered to them internally from the internal suppliers. And this divergence in viewpoint about what the standard is for what's being produced is a very important source of problems in organizations. The internal customer-supplier relationship can be formalized by creating internal customer-supplier service level agreements. And these can be formalized as a document with very specific metrics and so on. And this is an important idea that can drive a lot of improvement in organizations and can really help mitigate this problem that occurs around boundaries in organizations. So it's a very important idea. The basic idea here then is that internal suppliers should be very aware of and should seek to satisfy their internal customers. So I already said this is an important idea. The book really does not discuss this idea in the way that I have here and in the way that other people discuss it, but it really is important. And if you want another reference on this, the Wikipedia link is a pretty good reference. Now this brings me to another idea that you need to know about, and that's the idea of the hidden factory. And the basic idea of the hidden factory is simple. In any real production environment, manufacturing facility or whatever, generally there is good product or service produced and there is defective product or service produced. And you can look at this as if there were actually two production environments side by side. One factory that produces only 100% good product and another factory that only produces 100% defective product. And in many cases, the percentage of defective product is 15% or more, which of course is a huge number. This is why this hidden factory idea is so important, because there's 15% capacity available right there if you could just produce 100% good product. But this is the idea of the hidden factory. It's an important idea for illustrating the level of defect production and waste which occurs in most production facilities, whether or not they are factories or service environments. And I would suggest that the level of defectives and waste is typically actually worse in service environments than it is in factories and manufacturing environments. And that, of course, as a generalization, would not hold all the time. Another important idea is the cost of quality. I have PowerPoint slides on this topic, which I have posted, and I suggest that you go through those. This is another kind of question which occurs fairly frequently on the green belt exam, because they can give you a kind of cost and then ask you to classify it into the cost of quality framework. So I'm not going to say much more about that here, but I do suggest that you go take a look at those slides. Another term that you might run into are CTQs. CTQs are referred to frequently in many organizations that are implementing Six Sigma. A CTQ metric is one that's critical to quality. So these are the metrics which are considered most important for improving or maintaining quality. There are other kinds of CT, critical to metrics, that are discussed in the book. One is CTS, critical to schedule. Another is CTC, critical to cost. And I've given you the pages where those are discussed in the book. You do run into a variety of other acronyms in real organizations. Another one that I've seen frequently are KSIs, which stands for Key Success Indicators. But all of these ideas focus on really the Pareto principle, the idea that there is a relatively small number of metrics that are very, very important for the key category that the metric is focused on, whether it be quality, cost, or schedule. Another very important term that you run into a lot in Six Sigma is the idea of the voice of the customer. The voice of the customer refers to all customer inputs that have the potential to communicate customer requirements or customer satisfaction. And these can be broad in scope. They can be anywhere from a customer complaint to a customer survey, and I'll talk in just a minute about other sources of customer information. As Six Sigma has evolved over time, it has put increasing emphasis on driving the voice of the customer into the organization. So the basic idea here is you would like to link almost everything that's important out to the external customer and what's important to those customers. And this would include linking the objective of individual DMAIC projects to the voice of the customer needs and requirements and the things that drive their satisfaction, to looking at metrics on processes to make sure that those metrics also reflect that external voice of the customer. Now, to really effectively listen to customers, you need multiple methods and multiple listening channels. Sometimes this is summarized as multiple listening posts. So, for example, that might be customer complaints, customer surveys. It might be focus groups and customer research. It might be surveying your own frontline employees to ascertain their perception about what the customer wants and so on. But the idea here is that collecting the voice of the customer is not a single channel of information. It's actually multiple channels of information. Every time you have a contact with a customer, there's an opportunity. And so there is a need then to integrate all of this information coming from these multiple channels. So in quality function deployment, the voice of the customer is very important. And I'm not going to define quality function deployment here, but I'll give you a reference elsewhere to quality function deployment. Quality function deployment is about mapping the voice of the customer into the engineering requirements of the organization, both at a high level and down to the level of individual parts. This is done in quality function deployment with a collection of matrix diagrams. The first matrix diagram is called the House of Quality because it has a triangular roof on it that's used to indicate the correlation between the various engineering requirements. But the left-hand side of the House of Quality and quality function deployment is oftentimes referred to as the voice of the customer. And what these are statements about the customer requirements. In quality function deployment, in theory, these voice of the customer items should be actually derived from actual customer statements, usually collected in focus groups and aggregated and analyzed using the Affinity Diagram method. So what you basically do is take the transcript from a focus group, You break it down into sentences or sentence fragments that contain whole ideas about the quality of the product or the customer requirements. You write those on cards, and then you aggregate those cards together by similarity in the meaning of the sentence or the sentence fragment. And you actually essentially build up a tree using the Affinity Diagram method. So at every level of aggregation, you can then take one of the statements as being most representative and then take that statement and then cluster those statements for the various group according to their similarity and so on. And in general, in the quality function deployment, 3 levels of customer statements are used. So just to give you some idea here, in an automobile, you might have the idea that the cabin is quiet. Okay, and then the next level down may be that you can't hear any road noise. And the third level down from that is you can't hear any sound from the tires, you can't hear any sound. Another category might be sound from the wind, and so on. But in QFD, generally 3 levels of aggregation are used on the left-hand side of the matrix as the voice of the customer. All right, another topic here, and this is the most technical of the things that I'm talking about here today. Another kind of question that's frequently asked in the Six Sigma exam is to classify measures according to their type. And in the world of Six Sigma, there seem to be 4 types of measures. These are talked about in the textbook. They are nominal measures, which refer to things which are classified into a category. So that's like defective or not defective, or go or no go, or perhaps color or something like that. It's what a statistician would call categorical data. There then is ordinal data, which is categorical data that can be ordered. Okay, some categorical data can't be ordered, and some can. So for example, categorical data having to do with color, red, green, blue, etc., there's no natural ordering there. Categorical data that refers to something that's a ranking scale, like for example a grade scale, there is an order to that. The grade of A is better than the grade of B, and so on. Interval measures then are continuous measures. They're things like height and weight and length, and the outcome of those measures can be anything on a continuous interval. The book also talks about ratio measures. I find that discussion to be relatively, I don't know that I want to say incoherent, but it doesn't have a lot of meaning for me. So I'm going to follow this up with the discussion of types of data from the point of view of a statistician. But first, I do need to talk about one other kind of distinction in the data. The book also talks about discrete data and continuous data, and I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But asking about various types of data, as I just said a minute ago, is a favorite type of question in the Six Sigma Green Belt exam. So to clarify perhaps what was discussed before, I thought I would talk briefly about the way a statistician looks at the types of data. From the point of view of a statistician, there's categorical data, which is what in Six Sigma is frequently called attribute data, but it's data that falls into categories, generally a finite, generally a pretty small number of categories. A kind of categorical data then is ordered categorical data, and again, that's categorical data where there's an obvious ordering. Grade scales in school are an example of this. Also, Likert scales that range from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 in questionnaires are also another category of this. There is then discrete data, and discrete data takes values only on a finite set of values. So an example of this is the binomial distribution. If I flip a coin 10 times, then I'm going to get anywhere from 0 to 10 heads. And that is a finite number of values that experiment can take on. There is also discrete data that can take on values on a countably infinite set. And the example here is the Poisson distribution that models things like the arrival of customers at a counter. So there's no upper bound to the number of customers that could conceivably arrive. So the scale for a Poisson random variable starts at 0 and goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and it never stops. It keeps on going up to infinity, but only on the integers. So this is a discrete kind of data, but it's potentially countably infinite. There's also continuous data that are fractions, so anything that's a proportion, and that suggests to a statistician that a possible transformation would be the logistic transformation. Then there are continuous measures which are positive. Things like income would fall into this, or length. And when the measure is positive and the maximum in the data set is more than an order of magnitude bigger than the minimum, that's going to suggest a transformation of logs. There are also continuous measures that can be both positive and negative. This comes about, for example, when you look at a difference of two things. And data that can be both positive and negative is typically much harder to think about transforming. But anyway, this is a list of data types in statistics. I've given this list to you because it may inform and clarify the simpler categorization that is given in the textbook and in most Six Sigma sources. So this concludes my discussion of non-technical topics that I think may come up in the Greenbelt exam.